Hi kids, Mr. Ronayne here. Your teachers thought it would be a good idea if I read you a story. Now many of you know that this is one of my all-time favorites. And you know, our teachers have done a whole lot of extra work with this distance learning, and so I thought this might be a special book for them to read as well as you. Thank you, Mr. Falker, by Patricia, Polacco. Let's get started. Thank you, Mr. Falker. The grandpa held a jar of honey so that all the family could see. Then dipped a ladle into it and drizzled honey on the cover of a small book. The little girl had just turned 5. "Stand up, little one," he cooed. "I did this for your mother, your uncles, your older brother, and now you." Then he handed her the book. "Taste." She dipped her finger into the honey and put it into her mouth. "What is that taste?" the grandma asked. The little girl answered, "Sweet." Then all the family said in one single voice, "Yes, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee that made that sweet honey. You have to chase it through the pages of a book." The little girl knew that the promise to read was at last hers. Soon, she was going to learn to read. Patricia, the littlest girl in her family, grew up loving books. Her school teacher mother read to her every night. Her red-headed brother brought his books home from school and shared them. And whenever she visited the family farm, her grandfather and grandmother read to her by the stone fireplace. When she turned 5 and went to kindergarten, most of all, she hoped to read. Each day she knew the kids in first grade across the hall reading, and before the year was over, some of the kids in her own class began to read. Not Tricia. Still, though, she loved being at school because she could draw. All the other kids would crowd around her and watch her do magic with those crayons. "In first grade, you'll learn to read," her brother said. In first grade, Tricia sat in the circle with the other kids. They were all holding Our Neighborhood, their first reader. Sounding out letters and words, they said boy and look. The teacher smiled at them when they put all the sounds together and got the words right. But when Tricia looked at the page, all she saw were wiggly shapes. And when she tried to sound out words, the other kids laughed at her. "Tricia, what are you looking at that book?" they'd say. "I'm reading," she'd say back to them. But her teacher would move on to the next person. Always when it was her turn to read, her teacher had to help her with every single word. And while the other kids moved on to their second reader and their third reader, she stayed alone in Our Neighborhood. Tricia began to feel different. She began to feel dumb. The harder the words got for the little girl, the more and more time she spent drawing. Oh, how she loved to draw, or just sitting and dreaming, or, when she could, going for walks with her grandmother. One summer day, she and her grandmother were walking together in the small woods behind their farm. It was twilight. The air was sweet and warm. Fireflies were just coming up from the grasses. As they walked, Tricia said, "Grandma, do you think I'm different?" "Oh, of course," Grandma answered. "To be different is the miracle of life. You see all those little fireflies? Every one is different." "Yeah, do you think I'm smart?" Tricia didn't feel smart. Her grandmother hugged her. "You are the smartest, quickest, dearest little thing ever." Right then the little girl felt safe in her grandma's arms, and reading didn't matter so much. Tricia's grandma used to say that the stars were holes in the sky. They were the light of heaven coming from the other side. And she used to say that someday she would be there, on the other side, where the light comes from. One evening, they lay on the grass together and counted the lights from heaven. "You know," her grandma said, "all of us will go there someday. Hang on to the grass or you'll lift right up off the ground and you'll be there." They laughed and both hung on to the grass. But it was not long after that night that her grandma must have let go of the grass, because she went there where the lights were on the other side. And not long after that, Tricia's grandpa let go of the grass too. School seemed harder and harder now. Reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Tricia would watch the top of their heads to see if something was happening to their head and that wasn't happening to hers. And the numbers, oh, they were the hardest thing of all to read. She never added anything right. Line up the numbers before you add them, the teacher would say. But when Tricia tried, the numbers looked like a stack of blocks, wobbly and ready to fall. She just knew that she was dumb. Then, one day, her mother announced that she had gotten a teaching job in California, a long way from the family farm in Michigan. Even though her grandma and grandpa were gone, the little girl didn't want to move. Maybe, though, the teachers and the kids at her new school wouldn't know how dumb she was. She and her mother and her brother moved across the country in a two-tone 1949 Plymouth. It took 5 days. But at the new school, it was the same. When she tried to read, she stumbled over words. The cat ran. She was reading like a baby in the 3rd grade. And when her teacher read along with them and called on Tricia for an answer, she gave the wrong answer every time. "Hey, dummy," a boy called out to her on the playground. "How come you're so dumb?" Other kids stood near him and they laughed. Tricia could feel the tears burning in her eyes. Oh, how she longed to go back to her grandparents' farm in Michigan. Now, Tricia wanted to go to school less and less. "I have a sore throat," she'd say to her mother, "or I have a stomach ache." She dreamed more and more, drew more and more, and she hated school. Then, when Tricia was started in the 5th grade, the school was all a buzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant. Everyone loved his striped coat and slick gray pants. He wore the neatest clothes. All the usual teachers' pets gathered around him. Stevie Joe and Alice Marie Davy and Michael Lee. But right off the start, it didn't seem to matter to Mr. Falker which kids were the cutest or the smartest or the best at anything. Mr. Falker would stand behind Tricia whenever she did her drawing and whisper, "This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Do you know how talented you are?" When he said this, even the kids who teased her would turn around in their seats and look at her drawings, but they still laughed at her whenever she got the wrong answer. Then, one day, she had to stand up and read, which she hated, and she was stumbling through the pages of Charlotte's Web, and the page was going all fuzzy when the kids began to laugh out loud. Mr. Falker, in his plaid jacket and butterfly tie, said, "Stop! Are all of you so perfect that you can look at another person and find fault with her?" That was the last day that anyone laughed out loud or made fun of her. Well, all except Eric. He had sat behind Tricia for 2 whole years, but he seemed to almost hate her, and Tricia didn't even know why. He waited by the door of the classroom for her and pulled her hair. He waited on the playground and leaned into her face and called her Toad. Tricia was afraid to turn any corner for fear that Eric would be there. She felt completely alone. The only time she really felt happy was when she was around Mr. Falker. He let her erase the blackboard, so only the best students got to do that. He patted her on the back whenever she got something right, and he looked hard and mean at any kid who teased her. But the nicer Mr. Falker was to Tricia, the worse Eric treated her. He got all the other kids to wait for her on the playground or in the cafeteria, even in the bathroom, and jump out at her and call her stupid or ugly. And Tricia began to believe them. She discovered that if she asked to go to the bathroom just before recess, she could hide underneath the inside stairwell during free time and not even have to go outside at all. And in that dark place, she felt completely safe. But one day at recess, Eric followed her to her secret hiding place. "Have you become a mole?" he laughed. And he pulled her out into the hall and danced around her. "Dumbbell, dumbbell, make it the old dumbbell." Tricia buried her head in her arms and curled up in a ball. Suddenly, she heard footsteps. It was Mr. Falker. He marched Eric down to the office. He came back. He found Tricia. "I don't think you're going to have to worry about that boy again," he said softly. "What was he teasing you about, little one?" "I don't know." Tricia shrugged. Tricia was sure that Mr. Falker believed that she could read. She had learned to memorize what the kid next to her was reading, or she would wait for Mr. Falker to help her with a sentence, and then she'd say the same thing that he did. "Good," he would say. Then, one day, Mr. Falker asked her to stay after school and help wash the blackboards. He put on some music, brought out little sandwiches, and they worked and they talked. All at once he said, "Let's play a game. I'll shout out letters and you write them on the board with this wet sponge as quickly as you can." "A," he shouted. She wiped a watery A. 8, he shouted. She made a watery 8. 14, 3, D, M, Q, he shouted out. He shouted out many, many letters and numbers. Then he walked up behind her, and together they looked at the board. It was a watery mess. Tricia knew that none of the letters or numbers looked at the way they should. She threw down the sponge and tried to run. Mr. Falker caught her by the arm and sank to his knees in front of her. "You poor baby," he said. "You think you're dumb, don't you? How awful for you to be so lonely and afraid." She sobbed. "But little one, don't you understand? You don't see letters or numbers the way other people do, and you've gotten through school all this time and fooled many, many good teachers." He smiled at her. "That took cunning and smartness and such bravery." Then he stood up and finished washing the board. "We're going to change all that, girl. You're going to read. I promise you that." Now, almost every day after school, she met with Mr. Falker and Miss Pleasy, a reading teacher. They did a lot of things that she didn't even understand. At first, she made circles in the sand and then big sponge circles on the blackboard, going from left to right, left to right. Another day, they flicked letters on the screen and Tricia would shout them out loud. Still in other days, she worked with wooden blocks and built words. Letters, 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 words, 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 always sounding them out, and that felt good. But though she'd read words, she hadn't read a whole sentence, and deep down she still felt dumb. And then one spring day, it had been 3 or 4 months since they had started, Mr. Falker put a book in front of her. She'd never seen it before. He picked a paragraph in the middle of the page and pointed at it. Oh, and almost as if it were magic, or as light poured into her brain, the words and sentences started to take shape on the page as they had never done before. She marched them off to... Slowly she read a sentence, then another, and finally she read the entire paragraph, and she understood the whole thing. She didn't notice that Mr. Falker and Miss Pleasy had tears in their eyes. That night, Tricia ran home without stopping to catch her breath. She bounded up the front step, threw open the front door, ran through the dining room and into the kitchen. She climbed up to the cupboard and grabbed a jar of honey. And then she went into the living room and found the book on the shelf. You know, that very book that her grandpa had shown her so many years ago. She spooned the honey on the cover of it and tasted the sweetness and said to herself, "The honey is sweet, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee who made the honey. It has to be chased through the pages of a book." Then she held the book, honey and all, close to her chest. She could feel the tears roll down her cheeks. Oh, but they weren't tears of sadness. She was happy. So very happy. The rest of the year had become an odyssey of discovery and adventure for the little girl. She learned to love school. I know. That little girl was me, Patricia Polacco. I saw Mr. Falker again some 30 years later at a wedding. I walked up to him and introduced myself. At first he had difficulty placing me. Then I told him who I was and how he had changed my life so many years ago. He hugged me and asked me what I did for a living. "Why, Mr. Falker," I answered. "I make books for children." "Thank you, Mr. Falker. Thank you." The end. Patricia Polacco, very special artist and very special teacher, Mr. Falker. Thanks for listening.